Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leave. Thank you all for joining. This week, I have a special guest, and it is a bit of a departure from stories that you've heard in the past, because typically, we'll have stories of grief and loss, death and dying. But today, we're going to be talking about addiction and really how through the process of loving somebody who has an addiction, how there is a ton of grief and loss that comes with that. So I would love to introduce Jamie to you today. Jamie, can you introduce yourself and just tell our listeners a little bit about you before we get started?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. My name's Jamie Francis. I am married to an alcoholic. I guess I'll just dive right into it. I've been with my husband for 16 years, I think. We met when we were in our young early 20s, and we had like a very fun relationship. We spent a lot of time socializing and hanging out with friends. And my husband was always a really happy, easygoing drinker. So I never had any red flags at the beginning. My dad is also an alcoholic. So it's very normal, I guess, or it's very common is a better word, for children of alcoholics to marry an alcoholic themselves. But I honestly, at the time, had no idea that that's what I was doing. I was just drawn to his fun nature and the fact that he was so easygoing and calm and kind and all of those wonderful things. And we had a super fun relationship. And then we got married and I got pregnant, and his alcoholism kind of turned into, drinks at lunchtime. And he works in an industry where it was completely socially acceptable to drink at lunchtime and to drink after work and go to NHL hockey games and go to sporting events and take clients out and expense all of it. And so to me, I was like the typical alcoholic, even though I grew up with a dad who was very similar and I knew he considered himself an alcoholic. I still had this definition in my mind that alcoholism looked like a man or a woman living under a bridge, homeless. It didn't look like somebody who wore a suit to work. It didn't look like somebody who owned a home. It didn't look like somebody who was married with kids. And so I guess my denial about the whole alcoholism was pretty strong. I fully believed that he just maybe needed to wrangle in his drinking a little bit.
So talk to us about this part. I think it's a critical piece, because what we do know about any addiction is that there's a turning point, right? Where, we're just having a lot of fun and now it's problematic. So what were some of the early indicators that you saw that you felt like this is more than just having a good time?
For me, it was as soon as I got pregnant and we had kids, I was like, oh, do I want my husband not home for dinner? That doesn't feel right to me. And do most people sit up and worry that their husband is drinking and driving? Do most people worry about these things? Or are most dads coming home every day, to have dinner with their wives and not going out lots during the week? And so to me, I had these little inklings all along, and they started once we started having kids. So, but they were never these big waving red flags. They were always just these tiny little nudges inside that I couldn't really pinpoint it, because I was like, it doesn't meet my definition of alcoholism. He's just out having a good time. The amount of justification I did in my own mind and the amount of silencing of my internal kind of,
Intuition.
Yeah, my intuition, I was constantly silencing it. This isn't as big of a deal as you're making it out to be. And of course, he was validating that. He was coming home being like, oh, nobody else's wife is worried about this. And that's the disease of alcoholism, is that they want to convince the people around them that they also don't have a problem. Because if they admit to other people they have a problem, then they have to admit to themselves that they do too. So yeah, for me, it started when we started having kids, and then it increasingly got worse. So he ended up deciding that he needed to go to treatment. And I wouldn't say that he did that. He necessarily made that decision. I kind of made the decision and said, this isn't the way I thought it would look. And so he, kicking and screaming, was like, fine, I'll try going to a rehab facility. So he did. And it was a short program. I think it was 18 days or something.
Was there a tipping point? Did he get an OUI? What did that look like?
So he plays hockey, rec hockey. He went out and played a game of rec hockey. He drove home after having a couple beers in the dressing room, and he got a DUI or DWI, whatever you guys call it. And he decided he wasn't going to do that anymore. He was going to stop drinking and all of that. So then he went kicking and screaming to an 18-day program. And he was a different person and he learned a lot about himself and it was a great program. But I think that he was still a little bit in denial. I didn't know it at the time. This is all just hindsight. But he was still in denial that he had a problem. He felt, I think, that I kind of forced him, strong-armed him into going into rehab. And that wasn't necessarily what he wanted to do. His family members really strongly opposed it. They thought that I was being ridiculous, that he couldn't possibly be suffering from addiction, even though it ran in the family, that it couldn't happen to him. Look at him. He has a house. He has a job. He has a wife. He has kids. All of the same reasons that I thought. But the reality is that he was struggling in his mind. He said that, alcoholism is like obsessive compulsive, like you're completely obsessed with your next drink. And once you start drinking, you can't stop. So it is a form of obsessive compulsion. And whether we see that on the outside or not, that was the battle that was going on inside of his head. And so once he went to treatment, then he felt like he had to keep it a secret once he started drinking again, because now everybody knew. Everyone knew that he shouldn't have been drinking because he had just gotten out of this rehab program. And so he secretly started drinking. And I always say that it felt like he was always having an affair with the bottle rather than with another woman. It was with the bottle. Like he was constantly waiting for me to go to bed and waiting for me to leave the room so that he could, have a little drink. And so I ignored my intuition about that for a really long time too. Like there's times that I smelt alcohol on his breath and he'd be like, "What are you talking about? I've been with you all day. That's impossible."
And it hadn't occurred to you at that point that he could have been going to these great lengths to hide it from you.
No. Although like I said, hindsight, I do see the signs, but I chose to ignore them. I didn't want to believe them. I wanted to believe that we were going to have our happy ending, that we were going to have this fairy tale story that he went to rehab, he never drank again, and life was great. That wasn't the situation. And so he got increasingly more secretive about it. And with secrecy became this really toxic, really, I used to know him as a very happy, easygoing drinker. And this form of drinking and addiction had grown into something so much bigger. It had, he was constantly trying to get as drunk as possible, as fast as possible so that I wouldn't catch him. So he went from like having a casual beer, which in our past life would have been pretty normal, to having like, oh, I'm just going to buy a Mickey of vodka and I'll drink it straight.
And right, exactly.
I can just, take a swig of it when she's not in the room. And so he went from 0 to 60 pretty quickly. He would be sober one second and then very much not sober the next. And so I often wondered, like, what happened in the last hour? Like, while I was putting the kids to bed, what just went on?
Was he making excuses? Like, obviously you would see that his behavior was impaired and you're still trying to believe at this point that he is not consuming alcohol. So were you asking him about it? Were you just silently observing? Did you ask him and he made up excuses? Like, what was the dynamic between the two of you at this point?
In the beginning, I never asked the questions because I didn't want to know the answer.
Right.
But then it escalated so much that I was like, I deserve an answer. I want an answer. So I would ask, and he would always have a reason for whatever it was. Like if I'm like, why are you slurring? He's like, oh, I'm just really tired. Or, and a lot of the times the reasons didn't justify whatever the behavior was, but I still accepted them in that moment. I would be like, oh, okay. Or he would just avoid being around me. Like he would wait until I went to bed. If I was, watching TV upstairs, he would watch TV downstairs. So it was just like this game of cat and mouse so that he never really had to face me too much. And then eventually he knew I would go to bed and I would fall asleep and he was free to.
Okay. So take us down this path because that bubble of secrecy also popped. What happened?
Yeah. So he was supposed to be we own a business. He was supposed to be at a company function, a golf tournament that we were a major sponsor at. And he didn't show up. And as soon as I got the call that he wasn't there, I immediately knew, like my whole body, I started shaking. I knew immediately what was going on. It was just a matter of trying to track him down and find him and make sure that he was in a safe place. I knew that if he had missed a work function for our business, that he was in a pretty bad state. I knew for sure that it wasn't like, oh, he had had a couple of drinks. I knew that it was going to be pretty intense when I did track him down.
And I think what's sort of striking me is that you didn't go to that something else was going on. Like you knew immediately. So somewhere you knew what was going on, but as you said, you didn't want it to be true. But for your brain, for the very first place for you to go when he's not somewhere is that he's drunk and he's not able to show up. That's pretty telling,
Yeah.
that you were sort of almost anticipating the dreaded event, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely. I knew it wasn't going to be long before the shoe dropped. Like I knew in my heart, my intuition was telling me, I knew the whole story. I knew it start to finish. I just needed to validate it. I just needed the evidence. I just needed the proof. And you know what? To be perfectly honest, I had looked for the proof before this. I had scoured our house for bottles. I had looked for any sign or symptom of drinking. I looked for bottle caps in his car. I searched the receipts in his wallet. The way a wife who thinks her husband is cheating behaved is exactly how I behaved.
And did you find anything or no?
There was the odd time, like I found on our credit card statement a liquor store transaction, and I asked him about it. Like I said, he plays rec hockey, and he's like, well, we take turns buying beer for the dressing room, and I didn't drink any, but it was still my turn, so I had to buy it. And I bought that excuse, and I don't know why I bought it, but I accepted that to be truth, even though I knew in my heart that it wasn't. I mean, the denial for me was so glaring. And now that I'm out of that situation, I can see it. But in those moments, I turned a blind eye. And looking back, it's the first time I can acknowledge that I abandoned my intuition, that I allowed somebody else's kind of life and world to take over. Like I didn't believe me, I believed him. And that's on me. Like that, I saw the signs and I chose not to do them. So I had some healing to do around that, because that's a betrayal to myself. Everything that he did is a betrayal in its own right, but I betrayed myself. So that took some introspection after the fact.
That's really powerful, but I want to stop here for a moment because I think any of us that are old enough at some point have known something to be true, but have denied it because sometimes, and of course the therapist in me is going to come out, that I think sometimes we're not ready to see what we have to see. And so it's our way of protecting ourselves, right? I think it's our way of protecting ourselves when we are not ready to look at the truth, because if we look at the truth, that means we have to look at a deeper truth and what we're going to do about this information now that we have. And you weren't ready, right? Because it wasn't just about you and your husband. You had children, you had a family that you wanted to protect. And so for your husband to be drowning in this addiction and you to acknowledge it meant to sort of blow your world apart the way that you knew it. And you weren't ready for that. Sometimes we protect ourselves because by the time this happened, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you were ready to face it with him.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if you're ever ready. I felt as ready as I possibly could be in that moment. And sometimes I feel like the universe delivers when it knows you're ready. So
exactly my point. Yes.
I didn't have the courage to blow my whole world up, because if I did, I would have blown it up a lot sooner. My mind, my intuition already knew. But the universe put all these, acts in motion so that my world had to blow up in that moment. And that I didn't want it. In the moment, I didn't want it, but I also felt like such a validation. I thought to myself, finally, everything I thought, I was right. I was right. And I just felt validated in that moment, even though I knew everything I knew from that day forward was going to change. Like what happened yesterday was going to be a completely different life than from that day moving forward. So yeah, it was a very intense couple of days and couple of weeks. And so from there, that happened. And he, it was not a linear path by any stretch, but over the next couple of weeks, maybe even a month, he decided to go to treatment again, to a longer treatment. And he got a sponsor who's amazing, and he works the program now. And he has sponsees, and he's in a completely different place. But more importantly, I'm in a completely different place too, because I started going to Al-Anon after that kind of episode happened and my whole world blew up. And I started to go get some help for myself because I knew that not only was my whole world changing and I was navigating kind of uncharted territories for me. I know lots of other people have been in this situation, but I felt really isolated. I felt really alone. And I also didn't want the whole world to know that my life had just imploded. I wanted to keep up with the Joneses. I wanted everyone to think that everything was normal. I told everybody when he was gone away to treatment that he was on a work trip. I like even my best friends didn't really know the situation. I told one really good friend. I'm super close with my sister, and my sister knew the whole story. And of course, my family knew and his family knew. But other than that, I kept it a really tight secret. And, there's a saying that like your secrets keep you sick, and that I didn't realize that, but I was so sick. I was so sick with his secrets. And long before we got to this point, I was sick with his secrets because I was constantly justifying his erratic behavior. And even before I was willing to admit it, I knew that his behavior was wrong. And so I was always trying to stay one step ahead of it. And I was always trying to explain it and, have the pre-story so that if he did act strange, that nobody would think anything of it. And
when you say that you're sick with his secrets, can you talk to us about what you mean by that?
it wasn't just his secrets, it was my secrets. Like our secrets make us sick. Like I felt like keeping such a big part of my life, such a huge struggle in my life, such a betrayal of myself, and basically the falling apart of my marriage in that moment, I was keeping that to myself and I was completely isolating myself. It's not that my friends wouldn't have been supportive. It's that I didn't even allow them that opportunity. And so I forced myself into this kind of vortex of like really unhealthy thinking and really unhealthy thoughts and victimhood and all of that. And then I also, at the same time, simultaneously allowed his addiction to carry on. Like I was his perfect enabler. I was already coming in with the excuse before he even asked for it.
You were his alibi, right?
Like I was the textbook perfect enabler wife. I wanted to make sure that the mortgage was paid and all of his natural consequences weren't going to stop him from being in active addiction. I wanted to stay one step ahead of it. So I did. I wanted to make sure that we didn't lose any business because he was drinking at lunch and I don't know, maybe made rude comments or did something inappropriate or whatever the case may be. I mean, and I'm not saying he did any of that stuff. I wasn't there at any of these meetings, but I was constantly picking up the pieces and gluing them all back together so that our life could carry on, so that his active addiction could carry on. And he really wouldn't feel the consequences of his decisions because I was always there to make sure he didn't.
So when did your own bubble of secrets pop? So he went off for the 18 days and now he's been drinking all this time. You had this feeling that he was drinking. Then he doesn't show up for this work event. Is that the moment that the bubble popped, or were you continuing to not tell people the truth that were around you?
I really struggled with telling people the truth for a while after that. So then I started going to Al-Anon and started working the steps. And I realized that not everybody deserves my story. Like I deserve to have that kind of support system, even if it, breaks somebody or breaches somebody else's anonymity, or even if it, and I'm not saying like the people that share their stories in Al-Anon, but I was always scared to tell his secrets because I felt like it wasn't my story to tell, but my story was mine to tell. The way I felt was mine to tell. The troubles that I was facing were mine to tell. The isolation I felt was mine to tell. The loneliness I felt was mine to tell. The betrayal was mine to tell. And for a long time, that codependency, like I didn't want to hurt him by telling my story. But at the end of the day, I just realized that I needed to do what was best for me and he needed to do what was best for him. And if that meant muddying the waters a little bit, if that meant that our relationship maybe wouldn't make it outside of all of that, then that's what it meant. But I had to be true to myself. So I learned that not everybody deserved my story. Like I didn't need to go tell the grocery clerk that, oh, my husband's in treatment right now and I must, acting as a mom. Life is so hard for me. But I was able to share it with some of my closest friends. And I was able to share it with people that I think would benefit from hearing that they're not alone if they're maybe struggling with something similar. And I think just over the years, I've kind of gained my voice. I've gained some traction. I've built some confidence. Like when I first walked into an Al-Anon meeting, I felt so insecure that people were even looking at me And I basically hid. I like duck and ran from my car because I was like, I don't want anyone seeing me entering this building thinking I'm going to an Al-Anon meeting. Like that's the last thing on planet Earth that I want anyone to think of me. But I just realized that like there's just no shame in it. There's no shame in wanting to get help. There's no shame in going to a therapist. There's no shame in like community of people that have done it too, or, you know, that have been on the other side and they have gone through all of these things that I've gone through. And I think the more we talk about it, the less shame and stigma is attached to it. Like in those moments, if somebody that I knew and respected would have said, hey, I've been there too. I've been to an Al-Anon meeting too. My husband's an addict too. Anything like that, I would have felt like the weight of the world lifted. Like maybe I'm not alone in this. Maybe I'm not the only, 30-something-year-old mother of 3 with a brand new baby who's dealing with single parenthood because her husband's in treatment. I would have, maybe felt less alone. So over the last 5 years, I have gained that confidence. I mean, I found my voice. I've done a ton of work on myself. I've worked the steps. I've got a sponsor. I've done all of the things to make it so that my story is mine and that my journey is mine and my happiness is mine. So at the end of the day, whether my addict is drinking or not, I can still find that happiness within me because I am not his codependent. I love him and we are still together and he is sober and we have a very lovely life. But at any moment in time, if he starts drinking again, I'm strong enough in who I am and in my recovery that it'll be devastating, but it won't ruin me. Whereas before, I didn't know me. I had no idea who I was without him. That was it. I mean, my whole life revolved around him and our life together and, his alcoholism and staying one step ahead of that. And now I'm so confident in the fact that, if he chooses to drink again, that's on him and that has nothing to do with me. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad wife or a bad mother or a bad, I could have done something differently. It's all on him. And before that, in my early stages and in my denial, I truly believe that like, if I was just a better wife, if I, cooked more, cleaned more, had more sex, did all of the things, then maybe he would love me enough to want to stop drinking. And now I know it has nothing to do with me. It never did. Has nothing to do with our kids. And any addict, their addiction is cunning and baffling because people want to love them to death. They want to love them out of addiction, and that's not theirs to do. The addict themselves has to love themselves enough out of addiction. They have to, go to the places that they've been avoiding. It has nothing to do with the outside world. That was the hardest thing for me. The hardest thing to grasp was that I had no control of it. I didn't cause it. I had no control of it, and I couldn't cure it. He had to do that on his own.
This is just so powerful because, both in my work and in the people I interviewed for my book and people I've had on the podcast is when they lose people to overdoses, whether that's severe alcoholism, whether that's heroin, fentanyl, because everything's laced with fentanyl, the guilt that people carry with a loved one, because one of my very dear friends also passed from severe alcoholism. And even though in my work, I know that you cannot save somebody from their addiction, exactly what you're saying, but that does not remove that incredible guilt and anger that we feel when we do lose someone to addiction. That thinking, and that's why I love so much what you're saying right now is so powerful. And listeners, please hear Jamie's words of wisdom that as much as you want, you cannot cure the person that you love. The motivation has got to be internal, because that guilt can be debilitating to people if they've lost someone to addiction, feeling like they could have done something. And I want to move into this idea of grief because, you and I had an opportunity to have a really beautiful conversation before the recording today. And I don't know that people often think about grief that's attached to addiction work, right? You've got this great story, right? You guys are doing well. Your husband is very much into the work. He's very involved in AA. So I imagine listeners are out there going, I don't get it. Where's the grief? This is a happy ending. Can you help us to understand how this connects to deep grief for you?
Yes. So I think the grief process kind of started when my intuition started talking to me, because it was kind of the death of the life that I thought I would have. My husband and I got married at a winery, and I always envisioned, anniversary dinners, sipping wine, overlooking the vineyard. And this is just like a small, insignificant example, but like just little things that I believe would be our story forever had to change. And, little things like our anniversary dinner. Well, we can probably still go back to the winery because he's in a safe enough spot mentally that that's not going to trigger him, but doesn't have the kind of same luster that it used to. But the bigger thing for me, the biggest grieving piece for me was the anger. In the cycle of grief, anger, and I don't know how it would differ if, there was a death or something, but when the person is still present, when the person is still in your world, that anger is so easily directed at them because they are there. They're standing right in front of you. And so for me, that anger lasted a really, really long time. It was ever present. And I even find myself now, I will so easily get back into that resentment and anger phase. And I know that that's when I need to do some soul searching. That's my kind of cue to get back into program. But the anger for me was just so overwhelming.
What were you angry about, Jamie? Tell us what was under the anger.
Angry that he had put us in a really sticky financial situation. I mean, we own a business and he went away twice and he was the sole salesperson for that business. So I hated that. I hated that he had secret credit cards that he would put his purchases on. And obviously he had to have them without, me, not a joint account or anything. So, when all of that came out, that there was, a pretty significant credit card bill attached to it, I was angry that he needed time away from our family to go to treatment. I mean, as much as I was grateful that he went to treatment, I was also so angry. I'm like, oh, it's really nice. I get to stay here with a brand new baby, a 1.5-year-old and a 3-year-old, while you just go work on yourself. Must be nice. That was the that was the loop in my mind. God, when is it my turn? When do I get to go to the spa resort and just have a month to myself to just decompress and think about all the things I should be doing and whatever? But then also when he came back and was a different person and had, changed his outlook on life, I was mad. I was like, oh, how dare you? You're so enlightened now that you can come back into the real world and, tell me to calm down and stop doing that. Or, anytime the anger also presented itself or share his wisdom, because I was like, who do you think you are? You just ruined my life. Who do you think you are to come in here and offer some suggestions on ways in which I can, also become enlightened? And he's not at all that person. He didn't come in and be like, you need to change everything about you, but he would gently suggest that maybe you should go to a meeting. I can sense that you're feeling frustrated. Need to take some time to yourself. Why don't you go to the spa? Why don't you go to the mall? Why don't you just go have a coffee and go meet a friend? And I'd be like, don't tell me what to do. I just raised these children while you were off having you time. So don't tell me how to live my life. Even when he was trying to be helpful, my anger was just so present and so overwhelming. And even when I wasn't mad, I felt like I had to be mad to remind him that he messed this all up.
And grief and anger. I mean, I say this all the time. They're two sides of the same coin, right? Or depression and anger, I should say. And I always say it's a lot easier to be pissed off than to feel that deep sense of grief and loss and that pain. I think anger is sort of that, people are getting divorced. They go right to anger because, again, peeling back the layers of what is underneath that anger is the real work. It's the real heartache. It's the grief. It is so consuming.
I don't know who the original author of this was, but I heard somebody say that anger is just sadness's big brother. It's their bodyguard. So when you're too scared to say that you're sad, it presents itself as anger.
It's perfect. I love that metaphor.
And exactly what it felt like to me is that I wasn't yet willing to own the sadness and the hurt. So all I had was anger in that moment. I was so angry I could cry. You know that saying, like, I was so angry I could cry. Well, that's because I was really hurt. Just like such a betrayal. And I just felt so hurt by all of it. But I didn't know how else to present it other than to be mad, and mad all the time about everything.
And it's very similar to people losing someone. I remember when I lost my brother that I would scream, and I would scream into my pillow, and I was so mad. And it was the same thing. I could not at that moment face the depth of my sadness, because I thought if I faced my sadness that I might drown in it. That's what I was truly afraid of. So I was I mean, it's hilarious now to be pissed at my brother for dying, but we get very mad at people who die. And in some respects, there is a part of your husband that you lost during this, right? Because the fun that you could have with the drinking or whatever, he has now changed as a human being. He's doing deep work, which changes the dynamic of your relationship. So what happened with this anger where you were able to start unpacking what was underneath it for you?
For me, the real turning point was Al-Anon. Like, it was working the steps. It was finding out.
But how did you take that step for Al-Anon? Like, how did you even go about being able to get to that moment where you could go?
Honestly, I was just so sick of my own shit. I was so sick of who I was. I was so tired of being mad and sad. And I was just so sick of it. I was like, there's got to be more to life than this, because this is horrible. This is like the worst. There's got to be more to this existence. Like, I was mad bathing the kids. I was mad feeding the kids. I was mad about everything. And it was just like, I had zero joy left in my life. And I thought, I'll try this because everyone's saying it's helped them. And then I walked into the room of an Al-Anon meeting and I thought, oh my God, all these women are 100 years old. I don't belong here. They don't know what it's like to be a mom with a brand new baby and 2 other toddlers at home. Like, and then they started to speak, and they came with so much wisdom, and they had just everything that I wanted. Like, they were happy and joyous, and they were joking around before the meeting. And I was like, what's there to be happy about? Like, everybody in this room that loves an addict, why are you all laughing and joking? And then I realized, like, just after consistently going, that there had to have been some kind of secret ingredient to what they're doing. And if you want the honest truth, the reason I went to Al-Anon was to find out, like, the answer to the golden question, which is, if my husband starts drinking, how do I make it stop? Like, if he starts again, how do I make it stop? That's why like, if I'm being perfectly honest, it had nothing to do with me other than I was sick of myself, but I wanted to try and figure out him. And like, it's such an unhealthy way to enter, but I left that room with a completely different perspective. And this idea that maybe for once it had to be about me. Maybe I needed to get some help. Maybe I needed to focus on myself. Maybe I needed to, become selfish for a little while and do some soul searching and figure out where my resentments are and what they mean. What is the deeper reason why I'm so angry at him, or so angry at life, or so angry at bathing the children? Like, what is the actual meaning of all of these feelings? And so that's what I did. That's how I got to it. And then I owned my part in it. I mean, I had to keep my side of the street clean, which was, I was perpetuating a lot of the anger and a lot of the mistrust or distrust. And I was perpetuating a very toxic marriage. And I had to own that. I mean, if we were going to stay married, then I needed to keep my side of the street clean, which was to accept his apology and I'm not saying everyone has to. Everybody needs to do what is best for them in their situation. But for me, I still loved him, and I believed that he was ready for change too. He wanted to change, and I wanted to see where our relationship could go. And I couldn't do that if I sat in this really toxic place. If I stayed in that really toxic place, that really angry, hateful wife, we would never have a happy marriage. So I knew I either needed to get out of it or I needed to change my side of things. And so that's what I did. We agreed that we would temporarily stay married and figure out if that's what we both truly wanted while we worked on ourselves. And so we're still married. That was like, I'm going to say 5-ish years ago. We're still married, and our relationship is so different than the one that started off. Like, when we were 20 years old, our relationship was a lot about socializing and, naturally the progression of a relationship when you have kids and all of that, it all just naturally changes. But we never had any deep connection as a young couple. Like I felt like our love was more lust and it was more superficial. It was like, this guy's a good time and I really like being around him. It wasn't like, what's your deepest fear and what are the things that I realized in that moment. I truly didn't know very much about him, even though I had been married to him for, 8 years at that point. Like I didn't know really anything about who his soul was like. And so now I feel like we're way closer, we're way more connected, our relationship is way deeper than it was in the beginning, but it's different, it's completely different. And with that comes a lot of like grief of the last life.
So now you have rebuilt, well, really, I mean, I don't even know I would call it a rebuilding. I'm not sure what language you would put to it, but really you have created something entirely new together. And so when you talk about this grief, because you told me that you still feel it, there are things that you still miss. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so I think that all relationships kind of change, and especially with alcohol, because alcohol is the only kind of drug on the planet that it's not socially acceptable to say no to. Like even last night, we had dinner with friends and they were like, "Oh, would you like a glass of wine?" Said it to me. And I said, "No, thank you." And immediately they wanted a reason. "Oh, you're driving?" And I was like, "No, I'm not." But like they wanted an explanation. No is not a full sentence when it comes to alcohol consumption. Like they need to know why. And so that makes a lot of people really uncomfortable. And a lot of our friendships changed. A lot of people, we were couples friends that we were friends with, that we used to have dinner parties with, and we used to do a lot of socializing with. We no longer had them in our life. Like I remember the very first wedding we went to after my husband got out of treatment. And one of our very, very, very best friends walked up to my husband and said, "You used to be a lot more fun when you drank." And I was like,
Wow.
"God, you're an asshole." But that's the kind of thing that it's like, those were our closest best friends in the entire world. We haven't seen them in 8 years. And things like that, where I'm like, man, I just wish there was like some normalcy around that, and not on our end. My husband's able to be around people that drink and it's not an issue. But I feel like we're treated differently because of that. And so that grief is kind of ever present. And as we meet new people, I feel like that carries with us. Like, we moved to a new city about a year ago and we're meeting new couples friends, and we went out to a concert and we did some other things. And it's like the second they found out that we weren't going to be like drinking alongside them, we've never done anything with them again. Like, so there's this constant grief and this constant like, God, are we not enough? Like, and just alcohol makes people do crazy things. And I have to remember, it has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with my husband. It has everything to do with them. The way people treat other people, that's on them. And so in the beginning, I always thought like, oh my gosh, are we like, unlovable? Are we hard to be friends with? Or what's the situation? But I think the real story, the real situation is that they're not ready to look at their relationship with alcohol yet. They're not ready to admit that maybe they have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. And because it is so socially accepted to drink, to consume, to overconsume alcohol, that we become like ostracized almost, that we're the oddballs out because we're not choosing alcohol all the time. And I just believe in my heart, but sometimes I get overwhelmed by the grief of it, that, it has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with them, and that we are good people. We just don't drink alcohol, and that's okay. And that's on them. But yeah, waves of grief all the time. And then for me, the anger is also ever present. Like, I mean, I work very hard on it, but there'll be resentments that come up where I'm like, this is a deeper issue. Like, you shouldn't react like this for not unloading the dishwasher. This is this is your intuition telling you there's something deeper here and you need to do some soul searching. So my grief comes in waves, but my grief is also a constant reminder that I'm in control of my life and that I have the power to change it. And I know not all grief presents itself like that. I know when you lose somebody, like you lose them to death, that there is no going back. But for me, there is. And there's a constant reminder that the life I have now is way better, 10 times better than I could have ever dreamed of than the life I had back then. So it's okay to miss elements of my old life, but I have to stay present in that I'm so grateful for my new life because it's so much better.
And, I have to talk about this because, and I think I had told you this too, that when my brother died, I drank a lot. I hid it from my husband. I took a leave from work. I mean, I was a mess, just a mess. And I had lost a dear friend to alcoholism. And I just watched the way it destroyed people. And so last year I made the decision to stop drinking altogether too. And we own a pub, we own a brewery. It was a very conscious decision. It started out as a cleanse with me and a bunch of my friends. And then I felt so good and it felt like the right thing given what I've seen alcohol do. And plus, anyways, there were a lot of different reasons, but I think the grief is interesting. I wouldn't have named it that until I had this conversation with you. But since you and I had a conversation before today, I really started thinking about it. And I have felt grief and not engaging in alcohol because I love being around my friends, but there's a point for me. It is different when I'm not drinking with them. And there is a point where they can get silly and, that I don't get into that silly place because I'm not drinking, but it does change relationship. It changes lives. It changes the way you do your life. I don't want to stay out as late or just lots of different things, but I wouldn't have thought about it as grief, but there is definite grief in it changes the way you socialize. It's the best way I can put it. And drinking is an activity. We don't think about that, but when you're drinking, you're doing something. And so when that goes away, suddenly there's a lot of free time. I don't know if you and your husband have ever talked about that, but there's a lot of time. I mean, you got 3 little kids, so you guys don't have any time anyway, but there's this time that you have to fill even as a couple, right? Because you're not going out to eat or drinking or, staying up late. So anyways, it's just a very interesting thing to think about, this idea of grief since I stopped drinking. And I just wouldn't have thought about it in that way because it's even changed my relationship with my husband too. My husband still drinks. He doesn't, it's not a problem. But, it's different, just even having a glass of wine over dinner like we used to. Just for our listeners, I think it's such an interesting way to think about sobriety, both the way that it impacts our relationship, but also the way it impacts our life, even to the point where making new friends where they don't want to deepen that friendship because you're not drinking with them. And I think that you're spot on that when you're not drinking, even if it's subconscious, that people have to look at their own drinking and that's uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. But you're right about being with your husband. There is a bunch of downtime, a lot of time that used to be filled with, socializing with other people or physically drinking that almost forces you into a deeper connection, which can be uncomfortable at times too, right? Like you're forced in to have more conversation because there's less stuff to do. And so you're forced into learning about each other and learning deeper things. And so sometimes that's a wonderful thing, but sometimes that can be really uncomfortable. So yes, I fully agree.
So we're coming to the top of the hour and I want to ask you, because I end with a couple of questions and I want to make sure we make time for you to give your social media channel where people can find you if you want people to find you. I always have to ask that too. But I always end my conversations on this idea of self-love. And you've made so many powerful points. But I think that what I love so much that you talked about today was this idea. It was really a journey of self-discovery for you as a woman, right? And at 20 years old, we don't really know ourselves. I think that is a lifelong journey, but you had to also have the courage to look at your own stuff. You could have done a few things. You could have stayed angry. You could have divorced. I mean, there's lots of different ways you could have handled this scenario. Your husband had to have the courage to do his work and to get sober. You also had to have the courage to do your own work. So I'm going to ask you, what does self-love mean to you now? And what does it look like for you now?
Well, had you asked me that question 5 years ago, self-love meant to me like, getting your nails done and self-care. And taking time to get a massage when you needed it, and all of those fluffy things, which are good. And I'm not saying they don't have a place in this world. But to me, self-love is honoring my intuition. That's the one thing that I've learned, is that I will never abandon it again. If something doesn't feel right, it's because it's not. And if something does feel right, then I need to explore that. The other thing for me, self-love, is finding courage. So finding courage to just live out my dreams, whatever those look like in that moment. But I felt like I completely abandoned who I was. And the best way that I can make amends to my past self is to be the best person I possibly can be in the future. And a lot of times that takes so much courage. It's simple. It's simple to stay where you are and to get comfortable and to just stay in that comfort zone for such a long time, until you die. But for me, in order to make amends with my past self, I have to find the courage to do the things that I always dreamed of doing moving forward, because I am not that person anymore. And I don't want to be that person. And I want to be the best version of myself, for my husband, and for my kids. And I want my daughters to always know that they should pick themselves always. And if that means abandoning everybody else, if that means, leaving relationships, jobs, situations that don't work for them, then so be it, because they are the most important person in their life. And that's what I have to remember about myself too, is that I have to be number one. And that feels so selfish and it feels terrible sometimes. And I think just as a mother, that seems like unnatural to say that I am number one and I have to come first, but I have to. And that's just the reality of the situation. And that takes a lot of work. But for me, that's what self-care is.
Well, I can't possibly say anything to top that. That is so perfect. Tell us where we can find you.
You can find me on Instagram at Jamie D. Francis. So JamieD.Francis.
Jamie Francis, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for your true, raw, authentic version of your story and sharing that with us. I can guarantee we've got listeners right now that are in a situation where they are struggling either themselves with addiction or a partner. And so, listeners, I hope that this was helpful and to know what the other side of that can look like. And Jamie, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.